Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Enemy Territory Quake Wars for PC, Mac, Linux, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. What you're seeing here is the PC version. Shout out to Gamma12 for providing me with a working CD key for this game, because if he hadn't done that then I wouldn't have been able to play this online. So fair warning, don't fall into the same trap I did and find a physical copy of the game that doesn't have the CD key with it, because if you don't have the CD key with it, you can't play this online. So thanks to Gamma12 for helping me sort that out. This is a first-person shooter developed by Splash Damage and published by Activision in September of 2007 for PC, later on for Linux and Mac, and finally PS3 and Xbox 360. And with it came a brand new technology for the id Tech engine known as Mega Textures. And the idea here was to be like, hey guys, the id Tech engine can totally do huge open environments too. It's not just these super cramped dark corridors. And they decided the best way to show that off is by making a follow-up to the somewhat contemporary classic Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, which was the multiplayer-only free release that was based on Return to Castle Wolfenstein's multiplayer, but was greatly expanded, and was quite a bit better than Return to Castle Wolfenstein's multiplayer anyway. So it was a good idea to take that sort of gameplay style and bring it up to a more modern spec, because it had been about 4 or 5 years since Wolfenstein Enemy Territory. The thing is, instead of making this more Wolfenstein, they decided to take the Quake route and make it based on Quake 2 and Quake 4. More specifically Quake 4, which makes things kind of odd because this game actually received the T rating because there is no blood and gore in this game at all. The thing is, it's not really a problem so much as it's just a weird design choice. I mean, if you start to think about it, the rest of the Quake series were all M-rated, and then you get to this one, it's suddenly a T-rated game. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I mean, even the original Enemy Territory had blood and gore in it. So I'm not really sure if they were thinking they'd get a wider audience if the game was rated T, but it actually didn't work out that way. This game wasn't really a big success. As far as I can tell, it sold decently, and most of the reviews were pretty positive for it, but there's not really all that many people who continue to talk about Quake Wars to this day, and to this day you can still find more people playing the original Wolfenstein Enemy Territory than you can playing Quake Wars. I mean, when I went online, I could only find one populated server that wasn't full of bots. So with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out exactly how it is. Well, as far as the presentation goes, it is a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, this does run on id Tech 4, which means it's the same engine that powered Doom 3, and by the time this released, that was actually starting to look very dated, so this new Mega Texture technology that they threw in definitely spiced things up a bit. The big thing with that is that the terrain in the game is made out of a single 32,768 pixel by 32,768 pixel image. And by streaming that into your level, you're able to have a single texture take up the entirety of the terrain, meaning that every single map can be completely unique, as well as very, very large. And the mega textures themselves actually store information about the terrain itself, which means that you get a lot of information in one rather large file. Now, while that does mean that the environments themselves tend to look rather unique, because there is no tiling of textures anywhere in the maps anymore, it does require a pretty good PC to render everything at a very high level of detail. Now, of course, that's by 2007 standards, but at the same time, it still took a couple of years for the hardware to really catch up with it, as well as the patching that the game needed to be able to really be optimized. Of course, practical performance is actually pretty all over the place, even on very modern hardware. You may be noticing that the first-person animations are running at a much slower frame rate than the actual game is. The actual game can run upwards of several hundred frames a second at any given point, but those weapon animations are always going to be one locked frame rate. And that's because they locked the frame rate at 30 frames a second. Now, it's fairly easy to get around that with console commands, but at the same time, it means that the animations were all rendered at 30 frames a second, so everything tends to look pretty janky. But once you look past the rather clunky animations and the mega texture technology, you find that the game really doesn't look all that great. Part of the problem is that it has that sort of brown and gray and realistic thing going on, but it's also an issue of the character models. Now, these always had a problem in the id Tech 4 engine, and this one was no exception. Now, that's not to say that they all look absolutely terrible. They certainly look better than Quake 4 and Doom 3 at the very least, but they definitely look dated, and the game in general just looks dated. which is understandable, but then you gotta remember that even when this thing came out, apart from the megatexture technology, the graphics really weren't very impressive at all. For some perspective on why, Crysis came out the same year. It was simply a matter of id Tech 4 being outdated by that point. And when you move over to sound design, things don't really get much better. You have voice acting that is ridiculously cheesy and really kind of annoying when you get down to it, particularly if there are a lot of people spamming the voice commands. But then there are the sound effects, which are pretty all over the place. Some of the weapons sound relatively beefy, others sound incredibly pathetic. Most of the explosions don't really have much bass to them and end up sounding rather weak for what they are. It's just kind of a mess. And then there's what little exists of the soundtrack, which is fairly generic orchestral stuff that is meant to convey the human versus alien theme. And all I really have to say about it is, why couldn't we have remasters of the Quake 2 soundtrack? But of course, as mixed as the presentation can be, what really matter here are the story, or really lack thereof, because there's basically no story in this game other than, oh hey, you either play as the humans or the Strogg during the war that consumes Quake 2 and Quake 4. So really it does fall over to the gameplay itself to bring things up, and that's where things get fairly interesting. It's definitely an advancement of what we saw in Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, where you had 5 classes that you could pick, each of which had different weapons and abilities that you could mess around with. Each class has its own specific role to play, so if you are, for example, the field operations guy, or the oppressor as they're known on the Strogg side, then you create these deployable artillery pieces that you can then use to strike at long range with. You can also call in airstrikes, or if you're part of the GDF, the humans, then you get to throw down ammo boxes for your team. Which brings up something that's interesting to note. The way the Strogg replenish their ammo is not through actual dedicated ammo packs, but rather through picking up the same vials that will heal them that the Technician drops. Technician, of course, being the Strogg equivalent of the medic. So that does emphasize something that is different about this compared to Wolfenstein Enemy Territory. In Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, mostly what changed between the two sides was what weapons you were using, whether you were using a Thompson submachine gun or an MP40, for example. In Quake Wars, not only do the weapons you're using change, and not only do the class names change, but the class functions change a bit depending on what you're doing. The basic functionality is still going to be there. For example, the medic and the technician have the same role on the battlefield. They're both capable of reviving downed teammates, they're both capable of dropping items that will heal you. But where the medic's functionality ends, the Strogg technician's functionality expands. They are able to create spawn hosts out of enemy corpses that will allow their teammates to spawn directly where that corpse was. And of course they drop Stroilant vials, which will replenish not only a Strogg's health, but also their ammo. And that's really emblematic of the difference between the Strogg and the GDF, the humans. The GDF plays pretty much like you would expect after having played the original Enemy Territory, but the Strogg introduce an element of asymmetry. Now, it's not enough that the game is wildly different depending on whether you're playing as a human or a Strogg, but the differences are enough that they do shake things up a bit depending on which faction you're playing as. But that won't change the core gameplay, which is basically Wolfenstein Enemy Territory brought up to a more modern engine. I've already mentioned the class-based warfare, but the actual core gameplay is centered around objectives and teamwork. One team will be attacking, the other team will be defending and trying to prevent them from completing their various objectives. And these objectives can be anything from build a bridge to set a charge on the enemy control center or anything along those lines. And like in Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, you are able to do this in either just single map mode or in a campaign mode, where there is some degree of persistence between the maps until you manage to hit the end of that specific campaign and a new campaign begins. This allows you to better experiment with the rank-based unlock system, where killing enemies and completing objectives will get you experience points that will gradually make you rank up and get access to a new bonus. And these can be things like just having extra ammo on your person, or being able to drop ammo boxes that have a larger amount of ammo they'll restore, or things like that. Bonuses that mostly help out your team more than they help you out, which is something that's pretty much unheard of these days. It has to be all about me, and not about the team itself. And to that end, the game itself actually does encourage teamwork, because you do get these various missions that will pop up that allow you to get extra experience points to complete these sort of side objectives as well as the main objectives that you're trying to complete. So you might get one that pops up that says deploy a radar or deploy an artillery piece, or you'll get one that says capture the forward spawn or destroy a turret that's been placed, or something along those lines that will actually help your team out instead of just helping you out. Now the trick with that is not to get focused entirely on your side objectives so you can rank up, but rather to focus on your side objectives when it actually is a good idea to do so and you can actually really help your team out in doing it. And if you're playing the campaign mode, then your rank actually will carry over to the next map as long as there's still another map left in the campaign, so your bonuses will actually continue to help you out as you're going along. This encourages you to play smart and play well, and it's something that not very many other games manage to achieve. But then there are the problems this game has, and it has quite a few problems. None of the weapons handle particularly well. They're functional, sure, but they're just not satisfying to use in the slightest. And that's a pretty stark contrast to Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, where they handled pretty much like they did in Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and that was perfectly fine because they worked rather well in that game. Here they just feel clunky and underpowered. And that's if you even manage to hit the target, because a lot of them are rather inaccurate as well. And it's especially frustrating if you're basically point blank and manage to shove a shotgun blast down an enemy's throat only to have them basically just mow you down with machine gun fire like it's nothing. Also frustrating is the way the vehicles handle. For lack of a better term, they just feel incredibly clumsy. You don't really have any fine control over them, so if you're trying to get in through a narrow area, you're basically just not going to be able to do it. And most of the vehicles really aren't all that useful anyway. Unless you're dealing with the air support or the tanks, then you're really not going to worry too much about the vehicles except just not getting run over by them. And of course there's the map design, which is definitely functional, it definitely flows alright, but the designs of the maps themselves just are not interesting in the slightest. Instead of coming up with things that were interesting, the developers basically just said, yeah, we've got this mega texture technology, let's just make a bunch of really big maps. I guess it's a good thing then that Splash Damage is generally pretty good at making multiplayer maps. And then of course there's the bot AI, which generally isn't very good unless you crank it to the absolute highest difficulty, and even if you do that, you're going to find that about the only thing they're truly good at is just shooting each other. At least they're smart enough to play the objective, but it's certainly not anywhere near like playing real players online. Which of course brings up the problem of people who play this game and don't really know what they're doing. Most of the people still playing it do have an idea of how to play the game. They know to play the objective, they know to work as a team. But if you don't have your own team doing that, then it's gonna be incredibly frustrating because you're going to lose and you're going to be like, what the hell guys, why weren't you playing the objective? That of course does bring up the issue of deployables, because certain classes have deployable artillery or deployable devices that they can put on the battlefield to give your team an advantage. The thing is, there is very, very limited space on the maps to actually be able to put those deployables, and thus if you end up with a bunch of people playing those classes, then there's not going to be any space to place the deployables, and everybody's going to be very irritated with them. But really, none of these are full-on deal breakers. They're enough to weaken the experience, but not enough to kill it. Which of course leads to the question of, wait a minute, if none of that's enough to kill the game, then why are there so few servers? Why did the developers kill the stat servers? Why did Punkbuster stop updating for it? And more importantly, why did Steam stop selling it? Well, the simple fact of the matter is that there's no reason at all to get Enemy Territory Quake Wars. Why would you bother with this game when Wolfenstein Enemy Territory is not only better, but it's free? And that's really what killed Enemy Territory Quake Wars in the long run. Wolfenstein Enemy Territory is free, it'll run on just about any PC you can think of these days. It has a fair amount of community content and a pretty dedicated fan community, so again, why would you bother with Quake Wars when you can just play Wolfenstein Enemy Territory for free? Well, the only real answer to that is if you picked this up on console, because if you picked it up on console, chances are you didn't play the original Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, or you didn't have a gaming PC. Now, of course, I can't speak for console because I haven't played the console version, but by all accounts, it was generally inferior to the PC version, which means that I doubt a lot of people picked it up. And since the game is no longer available digitally on PC either, it's not really likely that it's ever going to get a resurgence. And even if it were still available on Steam, the price tag was always the major sticking point with this thing. Again, why would anyone bother with Quake Wars if you can play Wolfenstein Enemy Territory for free? And that logic persists to this day. You can still get into games with people playing them in Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, and it came out back in 2003. That's a testament to just how good that multiplayer experience is, and I can see where it would be nice to have it updated with a more modern engine, but Enemy Territory Quake Wars just wasn't the way to go. It ended up being a very underwhelming game that ultimately just ended up pretty much dying out completely. Who knows if the Enemy Territory series will ever get revisited in the future. Obviously Wolfenstein has, obviously Doom has, and obviously Quake is getting revisited now. But now Splash Damage is off doing their own thing, and Bethesda's track record with multiplayer right now is pretty terrible, so it's really unlikely that we'll ever see anything particularly good from this series again. Which is a real shame, because Enemy Territory was a really cool concept, and it was a lot of fun to play. Quake Wars, not so much. I give Enemy Territory Quake Wars a 2.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.